Now, as you know, last year, $450 million, yes, no question, goes from 60-40 yes to 60-40 no. The Voice campaign, which the Prime Minister will say was all about the high-end ideals, but the reality was this was his way to get straight into the history books. He was going to pull a Kevin Rudd. If nothing else, in the first year of his first term, he'd achieved something big that no matter what failures were to come, he would always have that as his achievement. But as we know, the result was rather obvious. Here is the way that it was called on Sky News. When it became clear that Australia had said no, in my view, you look at the numbers, it was hell no. But a lot of people have intentionally misinterpreted that result. They've misinterpreted it as, that's it, we've dealt with the question, it's been rejected, no more discussion about Indigenous affairs. Now, that's wrong. But equally wrong are the people who have just gone on and ignored what the obvious message was about Australians and new instrumentalities, trying to discuss race in a way where you're not really part of the discussion. Which is why the Voice in South Australia is bizarre that it actually has now become a thing in South Australia. They've had elections for it in South Australia, despite the fact that South Australia voted against the existence of said Voice at a federal level, yet there it was, of course, at the state level. Now, on top of that, though, is a process which is playing out in certain paces at certain times, and it is an uncomfortable conversation that some people will not let us have, but we are going to have it, which is the treaty process. Something that I would argue is even more impactful to Australians than the concept of what words are in the Constitution and about whether or not a voice could be overruled by Parliament or it would be able to be never be sacked by Parliament. Because this is the negotiation where, from one perspective, you are trying to deal with original sin, and from another perspective, you are trying to move the ball forward. But of course, in the treaty process, you have a whole series of complications about whether a country can have a treaty with and of itself. But the activist Indigenous population says, well, we're not really part of Australia. You see, Australia was kind of pushed on top of us, so we are still a group of people who aren't really part of Australia, therefore you can have the negotiation with us. And what is up for grabs is the conversation that nobody has been willing to put any detail to. But before the next federal election, and most likely before your next state election, these negotiations take place as we speak. Now, there may well be a happy medium that can be achieved here, but all of us know that something seismic is going to change as a result of the negotiations. Now, in New South Wales, they've decided to fiddle around the edges with it, maybe, but no real detail is going to take place until after the next state election, which is more than 3 years away. In Queensland, they were starting to move through the process, but then the opposition have stepped out of that process, and therefore the government in Queensland says they're currently not going to be pushing on with that process, but a re-elected Labor government, you would imagine, would restart the process. So we get to Victoria, and Victoria is the place where the conversation of treaty is the most advanced. Now think of all of that debate and all of that uphill and all of that downhill about the Voice and how little conversation there is about a negotiation which could change interaction between our fellow Australians forever. Now the treaty process in Victoria is one that had bipartisan support. But in fact the Liberal Party stepped away earlier this year in part because of the result of the referendum, which, remember, even in Victoria, was a hell no. In Western Australia, they're not too interested in the process either after the WA heritage law madness that was there at the start of last year, and things got way out of hand, so all eyes are right now in Victoria. Jacinta Allen has been cheering on this process and believes that it is the right thing to do. She will continue the work that Daniel Andrews put in place. Now, there's been no mystery about this being the want of the government. At the last state election, it was part of their policy. So If you want to say that they had a mandate for it, well, that's what this government will say. But we're now starting to get into the rubber hitting the road. Put simply, demands are now starting to hit on the table. Friday of last week was the first of the planning meetings that were being held about what the Indigenous side of the treaty process is going to demand of the process. Now, the people who in part are coming up with this are the people who had been elected to the Indigenous Assembly, or the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. One of the people who is a member of that organisation is a person who has had previous jobs, among others, as being a co-chair of the treaty process, and her position being right at the front end, right at the sharp end of what is to be expected here.